had and what a lot of fantastic papers and responses we've heard. So a huge thank you first to the Data Justice Lab and team. And I think we should all give them a round of applause for. And while we're here, is this being live streamed, Lena? Okay, so to all of you out there on the live stream, hello. And good that you've joined us too. And just because this is a UK-focused panel, I do want to also express solidarity for everyone involved in the marking and assessment boycott currently for better pay and working conditions. Really, we're... The title of this roundtable is Political Interventions in Data and AI. The subtitle is We're Fucked, and what are we going to do about it? So it's, and we've heard a lot of that, I think, today about like all of the problems, all of the issues. It's been ridiculously depressing and hugely inspiring at the same time, hearing about the forms of resistance to those injustices and harms that are now proliferating and I think undergirding all sorts of injustices that we've lived with, amplifying those that we've lived with for centuries. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the fantastic panel we have here today. They're going to then give a short introduction to some of their particular concerns around an opportunity for political intervention and one barrier relating to their experience and research around political interventions. I'm going to then lead a bit of a Q&A with the panel and open up to you for the last 20 minutes. So please get your questions at the ready and we can make it as enjoyable as we like. This is the point where you bring all those burning things to bear that you've wanted to ask in the session so far, but have not quite been able to. And we try and, you know, kind of bring the circuit around from those fantastic keynotes that we had this morning. So it's gone. I am joined by the wonderful Dan Mcquillan to my right, who is at Goldsmiths, has just written a fantastic book called Resisting AI, out last year, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. If you haven't read it yet, please read it. Then we have Sarah Murphy, a member of the Senedd here in Wales for Labour. Sarah actually began part of her journey as an MA student here at Cardiff and was elected 2 years ago to represent her community and is also trying to bring issues of data justice very much to the fore in all things in the Welsh Assembly. And then we have Rosa, who is from Foxglove. She's a co-director there. Foxglove is a non-profit fighting to make tech fair. And they have done some phenomenal work there, not least forcing disclosure of the secret contracts between tech and government during pandemic, and stop the Home Office with their racist visa streaming algorithm as well. So there's been some really fantastic work that we're going to hear from Rosa. And then next to Rosa, we have Kaelynn Narita, who works is also at Goldsmiths, I should say, doing a PhD there, but works for an amazing UK-wide collective called NoTechForTyrants, which is a student-led organization who are trying to sever the links between higher education, violent technology, and hostile immigration environments, which, I mean, I don't know what it's like in your institutions, but we face that very much on a daily basis at Goldsmiths. So guys, over to you. I'm going to start with Kaelynn. 3 minutes.
So as Natalie said, we are NoTechForTyrants, and we work on campaigning and researching against violent infrastructures and really looking at this intersection of tech, surveillance, and how they impact different communities. And I wanted to also kind of spotlight one of our reports that came out recently, the police abuse, which is just a fantastic piece of research. Everyone should read it. It's on the website. Today, I'll mostly be talking about some projects I've been personally involved with that are more on the student hostile environment education surveillance scheme. But again, there's been fantastic work from our organization that is really worth checking out. So one political intervention that I see in our work currently is really to continue to foster and have a empathetic and flexible framework. So I mean by this is really to think, how can we use our research and our knowledge to support different actors? So I think one really great example of this is we recently went to support Goldsmiths Student Union in their fight against the use of Seats, which is an attendance tracking software, and kind of asked them what they needed from us and worked with them quite closely to kind of build a workshop and a teach out to help educate and motivate the student population at Goldsmiths to resist this kind of form of technology. And I think this avenue of research is really important, not only in terms of creating new forms of resistance, but also to kind of create avenues and collaborative forms of research and knowledge practices. And I think this research really kind of inspired our current project, which is looking at the intersection of the hostile environment policies and education surveillance. And what we're seeing as we begin this work is kind of the pervasiveness of infrastructural technologies. So this means like back-end work in terms of things like Seats, which is just a software, even Turnitin, and trying to motivate people to care about databases. And I think this is a real barrier because they're less flashy, they're not as cool, and it's hard to continue to have critical and political conversations about these technologies when maybe we're not seeing the outcomes, the discriminatory outcomes currently, but kind of building collaborative methods to intervene in these infrastructures before we're seeing these violent harms. And yeah.
Okay, I've prepared way too long a speech, so I'm going to try and make this really short. And please tell me, I'm going to cut out about 4/5 of it. So to explain a little bit about Foxglove, Corey, Martha and I set up Foxglove, which is a non-profit, which is trying to tackle, in essence, the consolidation and abuse of tech power. We felt very strongly there are now a handful of corporations in the world that are dictating our public squares and our economies, and they are projecting power globally. They're extracting data and profits from nations and people to whom they do not answer. And worst off quite often in that bargain are in fact the people who are working for them. So we try and build teams across borders and across disciplines. So we try and bring together litigators, so I'm a UK lawyer, campaigners and communicators. And basically we try and sue big tech. We felt that privacy was an issue that so many wonderful civil society organizations were working on and really highlighting, but actually the use of power and trying to attack the company's exercise of power was something that we felt hadn't really been addressed yet. And to be frank, we want to bust the companies up. So we feel very strongly that nearly every social harm that the big tech companies cause, whether it's misinformation or worker abuse or surveillance, that is all exacerbated massively by their size. And this gets worse as you radiate from the center of the company's power, because people, for example, in Ethiopia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a case we're doing there, lack many of the political levers that are needed to rein the companies in. So I wanted to explain a little bit what on earth those ambitions look like in practice. And I was going to attempt in the next 2 minutes to talk about 3 different cases that we have ongoing in the Kenyan courts. I think I'm going to fail. I'll probably get through one. And these cases are really all part, I mean, they're kind of different sides of the same coin. Actually, coin only has 2 sides. They're different sides of the same something, which has 3 sides. And all 3 are attempting to fundamentally change Meta's business model. The legal cases that we've seen against big tech have tended to be for damages. And to be frank, these companies can afford the huge damages that they are being that are being awarded against them. And so we feel like the litigation has to try and do something different. And so what the litigation is trying to do in the cases that we're taking are to basically overhaul the entire working practices of content moderators for Meta, try and overhaul the business model, and to try and stop what we have called the neocolonial approach to the rest of the world. This is a term that Facebook uses for the majority of the world. So to tell you a little bit about the Abraham and Hosea case that we're taking against Meta, this is a constitutional petition in Kenya. Extraordinarily to me, as a UK lawyer in a country which has no constitution, the Kenyan constitution applies against the government and against companies, which is just amazing. And we are accusing Meta of discrimination under that constitution and of causing hate and violence to basically go viral in Ethiopia in particular, in the pursuit of their own advertising profits. So what we saw during the conflict in Ethiopia was the Facebook platform was completely awash with inciting and hateful content. It was described to us that Facebook acted a bit like the radio did in the Rwandan genocide. And Facebook fanned the flames of the conflict, causing horrendous tragedies across that nation state. We're acting for a gentleman called Abraham, who is an Ethiopian academic and whose father was doxxed in a couple of racist attacks on Facebook. And as a result of those posts, he was then gunned down outside his house and very tragically died. Abraham saw the two posts. His father is not on Facebook. He saw the two posts and he reported them repeatedly. And when I say repeatedly, like endlessly reported them over the course of the few days that followed their publication. Facebook did not take them down. In fact, Facebook only took the post down after we got some publicity about the case. So in response to public shaming, they took some steps. Meta talks about and divides the world into different countries. And all of the countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are called rest of world. And Facebook, although it has 638 million active users in rest of world, as they call it, only allocate 13% of their budget to that space in terms of misinformation. And we know, thanks to the Frances Haugen Facebook files, that Facebook has the ability to change its software design and change its algorithm in an extremely short period of time. So one of the documents that was published in the Facebook files there are two of my absolute favorite documents in the Facebook files. I don't know if anyone else has favorite documents in the Facebook files, but these two basically show a series of steps that Facebook took in January 2021 after the attack on the US Capitol Hill, which made sure that the most insightful, the most hateful, and the most dangerous content was removed within 2 to 3 hours. Okay, so US Capitol Hill attacks, within 2 to 3 hours, Facebook took steps to make sure that the most hateful, most dangerous content was removed, muted, or prevented from further distribution. In Ethiopia, a conflict in which 600,000 people have died, Facebook has taken none of those measures. So what you have here, to me, is a very clear discrimination where US lives matter and Ethiopian lives do not. And we are challenging the fact that that approach, that discriminatory approach to their investment, is unlawful under the Constitution. We are saying very clearly that if Meta had invested appropriately, if they had made sure that the posts that had been put up were removed, and they could have been removed by two different forms. They could either have been removed by the algorithm, their software design, but Facebook has chosen not to invest and train the algorithm in any of the 85 languages spoken in Ethiopia. So the algorithm does not work. They have chosen to employ 25 human content moderators, 25 people for a population of 123 million. And those 25 moderators speak 3 of the 85 languages. So again, there is no way, there is nobody at home in order to actually be able to monitor and figure out and make decisions on whether content should remain online or not. That if Facebook had chosen to actually invest and to employ content moderators, again, these posts would have been seen and removed. So we're arguing that this approach to content moderation is completely unlawful under the Constitution, and it's completely hopeless. And this is obviously a business decision taken by the company. And they have the ability to invest in software so it can detect local languages, and they clearly have the ability to employ thousands and thousands and thousands of more moderators. And what we're asking the court to do is to force them to do that and to change the design of the software in the way they did for the US to make sure the most hate-filled and most dangerous content is removed from the platform. There are two other cases I was going to talk about, but I won't. Come back to it.
Is it on? Yes. Wonderful. Hello, everybody. I am Sarah Murphy. I'm the member of the Senedd for Bridgend and Port Call. As you said, I got elected 2 years ago, but I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, I graduated from the Data Justice Lab here with an MA in Digital Media and Society. And I have to say, it is a very lovely day for me because Anna, Alina and Joanna are all together in the same place again. And it's wonderful to see you all, and thank you for inviting me. When I did my MA, it just totally changed my life. You know, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you start asking the questions, you can't stop asking the questions. And it was partly why I wanted to get elected, for sure. I really want to support my community, but I also want to see, not so much as, you know, people say I go into politics to put the policy into action. For me, it's about putting this action into policy and then making sure that it gets enacted, because that's still where we are, I feel, in this process. It's not been easy. We were talking the other day, I've been called a Luddite. I've been told that I watch too much Black Mirror. I had somebody in government say the other day that this AI stuff is really like starting now. And I'm thinking, like, right, okay, that was 2 weeks ago. But I do want to say that another thing's really, you know, I've been called, I think this area is still seen as niche. I've been told I'm an alarmist, looking for problems, distracting from the real issues. And to be fair, there are lots of problems and immediate life and death problems that our governments are dealing with. But as we know, data harms are real harms, and data justice is social justice. But I do want to say it is not all doom and gloom, and that is my main point for today. And my goal in what I do as a politician, giving relatable reference points and relating data justice to social justice and our political values. As you said, I represent Welsh Labour. I know that there's been a lot of people calling out these kind of like WhatsApp groups that all of us politicians have a chat on. I am on one of those. It does have my group in it. And I would like to say that sometimes it is used for good things, because there was a flurry of activity with people asking ChatGPT if they could come up with some jokes about Senedd members. And I was able then to kind of like infiltrate this conversation and point out that, you know, with anything like this, you just have to see it through the prism of socialism and cooperativism values. And a lot of that is about democratizing wealth and power, creating community resilience. There's the ideals of honesty and openness and social responsibility and just caring for others. There's the collective ownership aspect of it, there's the economic aspect of it. But I would like to say, for me, fundamentally in all of this is the education, training and information. Because when you think back to, you know, we talk a lot today already about like workers' rights. You know, like my grandmother worked in Policoffs, which was one of the biggest industry in the Rhondda Valleys back in the day. And they used to join a union on the day that they joined up. And then on Wednesday afternoons, you got time off to be able to go and have educational classes where they taught us about workers' rights. They taught us about collective bargainism. They taught us about our human rights. They had speakers come and speak like the ones that we're hearing today to tell us about how things don't have to be like this, how things can be different. And that is crucially, I feel, what we are missing. I kind of hope that maybe almost a decade later that we would have more of the language to be able to talk about this and that the public would be talking about this. We've got really bogged down in, you know, the freedom of speech kind of stuff. I thought we'd won that argument already, you know, but it seems to be the thing that's dominating this space. And so, you know, we talk about like how I'm trying to just, you know, like the easy stuff So for example, we're doing an inquiry at the moment into e-prescribing, right? And I'm just trying to show that, yes, there's going to be huge benefits to this when we have e-prescribing, electronic prescribing for our NHS in Wales. It's going to make things a lot easier. We don't have to have 4 billion pieces of paper flying around every year. Yes, but also what it's going to do is that everything's going to become digitized, and we're going to have a lot more people all over Wales who will be able to access and see what you're being prescribed, right? And I just wanted my committee to kind of look at it from the perspective of, what if you were somebody who was experiencing domestic violence and you're in a shelter and you have to go and get your prescription, and there is somebody who works in the NHS who you don't want to be able to find you, but they are able now to access your records and see where you've been prescribed something, right? And it's so interesting because this one is relatively easy, because I managed to find a wonderful professor. I'm aware I'm being streamed, so I'm not going to say who it is because he's not on record as saying it yet. But they told me that, you know, when they worked in the NHS, it wasn't uncommon, and they had to bring in a system to address the fact that there were staff who were going on, I won't be specific here, looking at athletes' medical records after a match. And they were doing this, and they had examples as well of people going in and looking at their ex-partner's medical records, and they would get an alert and they would go to the top of the top and they would be called in and they would be disciplined. And I was like, and are they then told that this has happened? And he was like, sometimes, but it's not standard. So one of the things that we're meant to be having embedded now in our NHS app is that you can see who has accessed your medical records. It was something that was meant to be a priority for it. And when I was speaking to people who were involved in this, they were like, oh yeah, that was on the list of things to do, but it's kind of just slipped off. So this is something that is possible. So that's actually a really easy example, because I can show people then that there's the offline to the online harm, right? And that makes sense to people. But I think what is more difficult is this concept of data justice. And like you said then, like, how do we actually get people to care, right? And I just want to, if I've just got time, just one moment, just to read you what I said in one of my speeches about the biometric data collection that's going on in school with children. But in this case, as we have heard, our children are being targeted first, and we are tolerating it. The opportunity to share their very personal biometric data for whatever they wish has been taken from them, because there is a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, a lack of will, a lack of engagement with young people, a lack, and this is crucial, of basic data literacy to really grapple with the ramifications of this, how this is really changing our society, our children's perception of the world, their perception of themselves in the world, and very much their futures. That is the part that I can't seem to get anyone to give a shit about. I don't know about you. And you swore first, so I feel like I can swear now as well. But that's where I feel like we're getting stuck with this. And I'm trying, and I don't know why. So any ideas, please give them to me.
Okay, thanks very much. The political intervention that I'm suggesting we need right now, which is not in contradiction with anything I've heard so far actually, is a social movement to resist AI. Because the real challenge to algorithmic violence requires structural change. AI isn't a sci-fi, but a radical continuity, as I'm sure has been emphasized today, of modernity, of bureaucracy, of austerity, of the anti-worker, anti-poor contempt that stretches from Charles Babbage, check it out if you haven't, to Jeff Bezos. Regulation and reform are undermined by the illusion of a fair status quo, but also by applying half solutions to the entanglement of the tech and the social. Social and technical structures are inseparable and should be understood as a whole, as an apparatus. Because our concepts, our relationalities, and even our subjectivities are materially constituted under specific technical arrangements. Under current conditions, as I suspect has also come out today, this apparatus is increasingly necropolitical. And AI will become part of the governance of who can live and who will be allowed to die. We're already seeing the return of eugenics all over the place. From educational genomics, just talking about schools, to Silicon Valley's well-known transhumanism and long-termism and all the other isms. Meanwhile, the EU, the supposed leading light of AI regulation, consciously constructs the conditions for mass drownings in the Mediterranean. And AI itself amplifies the climate crisis through emissions, yes, but also through the expropriation of resources, water and energy, but also through the legitimation of green tech solutionism, and also through its colonial universalism. What's missing, as I suspect we all agree, well, maybe we don't. I'll take that back. Okay, I'm going to say what's missing is this social movement to resist AI that has a positive vision of more than human solidarities. We need a prefigurative technopolitics, iterative interventions in both material operations and social relations that align with the world that we want to live in. Like the Lucas plan of the 1970s, where workers in a giant arms company prototyped alternatives ranging from wind generators to hybrid vehicles to kidney dialysis machines, actually, while at the same time radically democratizing their workplace. We need a movement that is Luddite, proudly Luddite, in its commitment to put down machinery hurtful to the commonality. That was the Luddite slogan, put down machinery hurtful to the commonality. We need a movement that is convivial in its pursuit of a lost cybernetics that can balance autonomy and coordination. It's time to move from the dystopias of cyberpunk and Black Mirror to the possibilities of solarpunk, to a vision of limited but creative tech in the service of social production and radical inclusion. Thanks very much.
Just a shout out to the paper on Luddism that came earlier before this panel that was saying exactly what you were saying, that we should all be proudly Luddite. Thank you. I think there was a very common picture being painted here. And we've heard lots of examples throughout today of, I think, successful moments of resistance to big tech around the world. Places where these social certainly movements around technology are taking place in particular communities. And I think that's beginning in certain ways. But I guess my anxiety is many of those things are small scale and disparate, and the world gets worse, right? You know, so these things are growing, they're building. There's a sense of the harms that technology reaps, but yet things still get worse. And that comes a little bit back down to what Rosa was saying about you know, these are the biggest oligopolies we've ever seen. This is power, corporate power we've not yet really come across in certain forms, although we can argue that, of course, but you know, they're certainly very powerful. So what is it that we think, you know, if we're going to really tackle this as social justice, not as just data injustice, but as social justice, shouldn't we be looking at the root harms, the root causes of those injustices to see where our efforts, our politics, our interventions, our forms of resistance are best placed? Is technology the best focus?
So, yeah, I was kind of trying to say, of course, that it is a focus, right? In the sense the Luddites were the last ones that had a real grasp on the techno-political nature of power. You know, I'm not knocking Chartism, I'm all for it, right? But it has led us to this kind of, dependency on representationalism. So yeah, we have to focus on the tech, but not as the tech, as part of this social apparatus that all needs restructuring. God, all needs restructuring. And I just want to say, because obviously if I had all the answers, we wouldn't be here, we'd be out in the streets doing something. But I do think it's quite a dangerous time, actually. It's a dangerous time, not just because of what's happening, because that's clearly dangerous, not in the existential risk bullshit. We're okay to say that now, are you? Yeah, bullshit. The existential risk, we're all about that way, yeah, good. So the existential risk, that's bullshit, because we're already living in existential risk. A lot of people around the world have been living in existential risk since the 1500s. It's already here. That's the kind of existential risk we've got to deal with. Okay, that's dangerous. But the other danger, right, is falling back on the same kind of thinking, the same kind of structures, the same way of scaling that created the problems in the first place. That's also what we must resist.
Yeah, I agree. And I suppose it comes back to what I said at the end of my introduction, which is, it is just a huge question and it feels really overwhelming. And I guess what I do in my day-to-day is that I just try to do a little bit, and just keep the conversation going and just try to, like I said, give people relatable reference points. I mean, I always say to myself, like before I do like a media interview, I just say to myself before I go on, so I don't get nervous, just imagine you're talking to your next door neighbor, Bob. And I'll be honest with you, if Bob was in this room right now, he wouldn't have a clue what any of us are talking about. He just wouldn't, And I guess that's why I was saying a lot of this does come back to the education and having the language around this to be able to discuss it. I think there's a bit of I think about this a lot. Are people apathetic, or are they just worn down by the sense that what we're up against is too big? And I think there's a difference there, like what's the point? That's why hearing from you is just tremendous, because look at you, like you're doing it, you're showing that it can be done. This is what gives us hope, right? So like I said, I focus on the smaller things that I can do. Like I said, the biometric data collection in schools, I go into schools and I talk to young people about it. And once they understand what on earth is going on, they don't want it, and they're the ones who are going to have to come forward really and say that they don't want it. At the moment, my Bridgend Youth Council, for example, they're completely against it. I'm trying to set up so that they can talk to the students in New York who managed to get it completely outlawed, basically. They stood up and they said, we're not having this in our schools, and they listened to them. And I think that that's one way where we can use this kind of technology really to link up my students in Bridgend with those young people in New York, and get them to share that information amongst themselves, really. So go back to the grassroots, go back to the education, go back to those parts of our culture and democracy and politics that worked before, because I don't think a revolution is coming, because a revolution comes when there's a tipping point where things are so bad for the majority and things are not going to be bad enough for a big enough, for a majority. So we've just got to kind of keep going from the grassroots up, I think.
Where do I talk? Do I talk into this?
Right,
This? Talk into this. So I guess as a lawyer, I have a kind of framework in which I have to figure out a way to do something about what I see. And the way that we've approached the kind of extraordinary power and, I would say, obscene levels of wealth that the big tech companies have is to think about trying to, in essence, check that power either through using competition law, which is about making sure they don't get any bigger, or in fact, busting them up into smaller pieces, and through labor law. So one of the myths, I think, that big tech kind of encourages us all to believe in is the idea that these companies are, the result of the genius of a handful of predominantly white men. Whether it's Mark in his dorm or Elon on his couch or whoever these people may be. and that actually their incredible success is all due to the genius of these individuals. The reality, I think, is actually completely different. And the success and the wealth of these companies is basically brought about through the labor of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So when you think about all of the social media platforms, in fact, what is crucial to their business model are content moderators. Without content moderators, all those platforms would fold overnight. And because no one would want to log on to them because they would be so awash with content that none of us would want to watch. So just to give you a kind of daily experience of a content moderator, someone who works at TikTok, I think looks at about 4,000 videos a day, and 80% of them are extremely toxic. We're talking children being raped, people being live beheaded, torture happening in front of your faces. Like, none of us would log on to these social media platforms unless content moderators continue to do their work. And so I also think these companies, I mean, they aren't unicorns. We've definitely seen them, we've seen corporate power like this before. When you look at something like the oil industry or the railway systems, these are companies whose power we can check, and it probably has to be done on a national level as well as a global level. But I think the combination of labor, making sure that the individuals who are being horrendously exploited, abused, and in a very racist way, as I've described with what's happening, for example, at Meta, actually these individuals are, if we can find ways to make sure they can assert what are their rights already in almost all national kind of labor rights spaces, and also use the antitrust laws. We can see some amazing work being done in the US by Lena Khan, trying to make sure these companies get no bigger and indeed are made smaller. I think the combination of those two kind of sets of laws being properly and assertively and appropriately placed onto the companies, and they're held accountable to that rule of law, I think we would see a very different kind of factual position in relation to them.
Yeah, I think what I would like to speak about is kind of this idea of navigating from the edges. So why is it important to think about technology, and what's at stake if we focus too much on technology? And I think this is something that we do really well at NoTechForTyrants, is we're very deliberate in how we organize and how we participate with communities. And I think kind of mirroring a lot of what we heard this morning is how can we reshape how we see technologies and not kind of over dramatize the kind of magic of these technologies, and think what kind of social context, what kind of social structures are really kind of integrating within these technologies, and how can we kind of work through this lens to overall think of these new systems and think of a new abolitionist future. And I think my importance and kind of what motivates me to continue thinking about technology is that these are just the practices in which oppression and discrimination are being kind of hidden and obscured. And if we kind of interrupt this feedback loop, I always kind of get the questions from my supervisors about, what is new at the border? Why is this technology important? And I think this is a really important point to always ask ourselves as researchers, be that in the space of activism or in higher education, what are we putting out there? And kind of what is new, and what are we exaggerating to the point that we're missing kind of the grassroots discrimination not grassroots discrimination, kind of the ground discrimination that's always occurred, and we don't want to overemphasize this. So I think it's very important to be in these spaces in a very deliberate way.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to sort of come back in a way. What I'm trying to do is clearly regulation is not my focus, but I think the example of the oil industry is quite interesting in hopefully a positive way, in the sense that clearly regulation can have an effect and is clearly limited in terms of its ultimate effects, because we're still, the extractive industries are still running the world into, into ignition. So, we've got a kind of and thing there. We need an and really badly. And just in terms of the kind of relatability and also the communication of the sort of the reality of these industries, of the kind of thing you described, the way I've been thinking about it the last couple of weeks really is trying to say, AI is a dirty industry. Like coal extraction or something. Would you want to go back to like mass coal extraction? Well, if you're the UK government, you do. No, that's what I mean. I'm saying, that lot, right? They do really want to go back to mass extractivism, but most people are going like, that looks like a bad idea because the planet's on fire, right? And it's also environmentally damaging in so many ways, right? And AI is a dirty industry. It's a dirty industry. It robs raw resources. It pollutes both, and again, this is for me, on all fronts, it pollutes relationally, conceptually, and materially. There's really good, I know I missed a lot of what he was saying, but I suspect some of it would have focused on, for example, those collisions between data centers, actual material structures, or other kinds of infrastructure, that of course are impacting the most marginalized communities first. So this is why starting from the margins again is a really important thing. But they're doing more than, they're doing all of that. They're not just rubbing out people's capacity to physically exist. They're rubbing out their idea of what the world could be instead. Because it's a question of, a phrase I'm borrowing, of ontological politics. I know it's not going to go down too well, but right, what it means is what really is the world? What exists? Or what should we push for to exist? Is it this dirty industry? Or is it a way of living, more in harmony with the planet?
I'm going to come over to you lot because I'm sure I want to engage this over here. So I've seen a question here. I'm going to run over. Sorry, one first behind and then in front. You can pass it between you. And we'll take a couple of questions at a time, maybe 3. We'll do a load of 3. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come Laura.
Hi, thanks for a lovely panel. And yeah. I've been thinking about the ways in which, we talk about collective experiences, talk about collective action. You go back to what we've learned from successful, semi-successful community organizing against technologically dependent framings of the algorithm or AI. And we've seen movements in the Netherlands against social security AI or child benefits AI, which dismantled the government briefly. We've seen the fuck the algorithm mass protests in the UK, again, with a focus on, making governmental or bureaucratic action happening, or those shifts in local government. I'm wondering, how do we transpose these successes of collective action against the government use of technologies, which we all hate, or which are objectively being harmful and have generated affective action in a way in which we've seen that, people are out on the streets protesting against these things and voting these technologies out effectively. How do we do this against large global corporate behemoths like Facebook and Google and Apple, which are very much embroiled in the kinds of harms that we want to avoid, but we're unable to collectively organize at the same level. And I'm wondering, what would you think is the role of, the labor that kind of is responsible for making these technologies work? And what is the role of the publics that are dependent on these technologies? So does refusal have a role? Is there something, as kind of Dan was mentioning, what is the future for all of the publics, including us who are parts of these platforms as well?
Thank you. Lots in there. Well, I'm going to take this here as well.
Yeah, hi, thanks for this panel. Just riffing off a bit of the neo-Luddite idea, I was wondering how the panelists feel about violence as a form of social action or collective action. Because from Luddism, they were called the machine breakers, but you have violence both in sort of destroying certain infrastructures, but also protecting a movement. And building off Peter Geldroos's book, How Non-Violence Protects the State, actually only having a non-violent repertoire, he argues, is just basically protecting the state and the status quo, because you will only have small reformists to move forward.
Thank you. I'm so glad this is being live streamed. And we're going to go to, I think it's there in the middle, yes.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sebastian, and I have a question for very much, all of you. Thank you for the work, for your presentation and the work that you have been doing. So at some point, Dan mentioned these questions about existential threats and those kind of things that have been put forward by AI scientists, industry leaders, and so on in different letters. So I was wondering whether it might be more strategic to form a sort of strategic alliance with those groups that we know their concerns are not focused on justice. Jeffrey Hinton, former Google, I think, worker, was pretty clear. He said, like, there are existential threats and justice concerns, and he thinks like the former are the most important ones. But I was wondering if we want to be strategic and have an impact, maybe we can also work somehow with those computer scientists or people from other fields who might want to have a reform or, I don't know, put forward change, bring about change in different ways. I don't know. Do you think whether you think that's possible or not?
Great, thank you. And we'll do one last one for this round. It's Laura, isn't it? Laura, yeah. Tracy, sorry.
I just wanted to thank you for doing technopolitics and for being technological citizens and doing what's called technological citizenship. So technological citizenship coming from Darren Barney and technological politics coming from Andrew Feenberg. And the idea is if you have power, you have knowledge, and you have the capacity to act, and you are doing that in that particular space. And I'm not sure which pronged approach works best, although I think all of them together and all the different levels are absolutely necessary. My question is how do we begin to have the concept of technological citizen and technopolitics on the table? We are technological societies at the end of the day. We have huge technological budgets. We have huge science budgets in all nation states, big and small, developed or not. How do we move forward to bring these conversations forward so that we can be a more participatory in it? And it's not just the Facebooks of the world, it's what we procure. It's the data brokers. It's the challenges we put forward and the research questions that we put forward by funding institutions. So thank you very, very much for doing this work.
It's great set of questions. So you can.
I'm itching because I'm sorry, but the answer is really obvious. Become politicians. And I know that sounds like, but seriously, why aren't you becoming politicians? You have all of those things that you just described, right? All of you do. How many countries, communities are we all from in this room? Get out there and get involved and get as high as you can and get to a position where you actually have some influence and you can do things. Because again, I know I keep going back to it, but I keep going back to like the workers' rights movement. That's what they did. They pushed out the big landowners and the people who had all the power and the money, and they pushed people who are from their communities through so that they became the politicians in Westminster and they had some influence. And that's how political parties were formed and that's how the unions were formed. So that's what I'm telling you all today. If you haven't thought about it, please become politicians. And I will give you, and join a union. Join a union. I'm in 5. I'm a cooperative party. And I will just give like this example of exactly that as well. And like I said, I'm trying to bring a bit of hope to this because there is so much hope. But we had an inquiry into domestic violence and abuse against migrant women in this country. And we went down and we interviewed some people who are providing a service in Swansea. And these questions wouldn't have been asked if I hadn't been there. And I'm taking credit for that because I said to them, I was like, do you think that there is a correlation between some of these women going to the police and then them being deported? And they said yes. And because I was able to ask that question, we were able then to go and look for more research. And there's a wonderful group called Step Up Migrant for migrant women that's based in London. And what they had already been calling for was a firewall between the police and the Home Office to stop any of this data being shared. And we heard that evidence, we invited them to come and speak to us. It went into our report and the Welsh Government accepted it. We have not got the powers, the policing isn't involved, the Home Office isn't involved, but our health service is involved and our social services is involved. And they have now agreed that they will put a firewall in place between our health and social services and the Home Office and the police. And that is huge, because for these women, they go into these groups, they've been advised to go to the police, they've been threatened by the perpetrators with being sent back to their country without their children. It happens all the time. This was absolutely happening. And this is something that can actually be done. And I know it's only a stepping stone to all the other things that we want, but because I was in the room, and the same could be said for you, because you're in the room, these questions get asked, these things get put in place, these things start getting talked about. There is power in this. So that is my answer to all of those questions you just asked. Become a politician.
Violence.
Well, violence. I'm going to have to abstain from this question, I think, as a representative for a whole collective. But yes, you know, one-on-one, I'm happy to speak about it, but I'm representing a group and I don't want to misrepresent. But I think to this question about being a digital citizen, I think it's very important. And I think to kind of reiterate about getting involved locally, but perhaps as well just to engage with kind of perspectives that are not your own. So how do we, you know, as well as lovely as this space is, we're kind of preaching to the choir in a lot of our space. So how can we, as digital citizens, approach things empathetically and kind of use this trickle effect to these questions about global kind of massive big tech corporations. I'm always down for breaking things into smaller pieces and not getting overwhelmed. And I feel very politically inspired by our politician here. Well, I'll never be a politician myself. It's just to, again, to break down these things locally. And kind of as we see in the UK, we're seeing not only big tech, but these small corporations or consultancies that are really building, again, this infrastructure that is going to kind of construct how we are governed and governing. So I think, again, like breaking things down and not not overthinking, but not being so overwhelmed by this idea of just the Silicon Valley, but how can we think of things just in the UK of how things are being navigated as well, and kind of use these kind of like trickle of more knowledge, more power ideas. So, yeah.
Those were 4 enormous questions. I'm kind of slightly daunted about how to approach any of it. I think I'd like to go back to the Fuck the Algorithm protests, because for me, that was a really exciting moment. It was the first time Foxglove had been talking about algorithms for ages. We'd sent off a letter of claim challenging the A-level algorithm because it was clearly unlawful on so many different ways. And that moment when there was that protest and it was absolutely clear the government was going to scrap the entire thing. And, you know, let's be honest, I think it was a whole range of different things that caused that decision. I'm sure the head of Eton's letter to Bojo made an impact. I'm sure the threat of litigation made an impact. I'm sure that protest made an impact. And it was about the combination of those different, very, you know, different kind of sectors of society showing a moment of solidarity across the piece. I think that was incredibly important and really showed that actually there is an ability to take back power in a really fundamental way. And so trying to think about that in terms of what's happening in the corporate space, you mentioned Amazon, and you may all be aware, but there is something incredibly exciting happening in Coventry in relation to Amazon. And there has been about, I mean, years worth of work by the trade union there, GMB, which since August has led to an incredible increase in union membership in one fulfillment centre in Coventry, to the point at which they did make an application for union recognition. And under the law, you need a 50% membership to get automatically recognised, and you can be to 30 to 40% and show a kind of majority of the bargaining unit want the union present. And I think Amazon, in response to that, has basically thrown the most extraordinary amount of money at the warehouse. So I think that is, and to give you a figure, I was told the other day by somebody, I don't know if I should mention who it was, but there was somebody who told me on good authority that Amazon had spent $16 million over the course of a few months in the US on direct anti-union activity. And the fact they're spending that amount of money in Coventry, what they're doing is, so at the time when GMB started to really begin to increase their membership, Amazon put out a statement saying that the fulfillment center had 1,300 workers in it. They now, because they saw that GMB had about 800 members, have employed suddenly an extra 1,400 people at that fulfillment center. So they now have about 2,800 workers at that fulfillment center at a time which is June. There's no massive Christmas surge. This is clearly an attempt to make sure that the union can't get the numbers in order to ensure union recognition. So this is a company who is so scared about the fact that a union might be recognized in one fulfillment center in the UK. I think that speaks volumes about the importance of that fulfillment center being properly unionized. And so I think in terms of acts of solidarity, trying to think about ways to support and encourage that union work in Coventry would be a hugely important act of all of us. And one of the things that I know is that a lot of the people that Amazon has managed to recruit in the extra 1,400 workers that they do not need is a huge number of them are students. And actually trying to encourage all those students to become GMB members in order to make sure that that 50% figure can be found feels like an incredibly important, very practical, I think very achievable ambition that would make a huge dent on Amazon. And clearly it would, because they are like throwing money at Coventry Fulfillment Centre to make sure that it doesn't get unionized. So I think there are really things that can happen. And I think we've seen, even in recent history, the ability to change government decisions on algorithms. And I think there is an ability to make a real inroad into that kind of corporate power through things like what are happening in Coventry.
Yes, come in. And I'm just going to take, just a warning, I'm going to take one last round because we're already at 6:10, and then I'm going to ask the panel to wrap up in answering the final round of questions with a final response. So please.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak first to the question about labour in a way, which has all come up all the way through. Just offer a kind of another and in a way, another sort of slightly different spin on it, which is to look at things like the Viomi factory in Greece or the GKN factory occupation currently in Italy, where what you have there is, which could become, there could be a lot more of those very easily in the very near future, the way things are rearranging. What's happening in those kind of places is that, yes, the workers take some control over the factory, but then they ask the community. Well, they get the community because they are the community, obviously, right? As well, sorry. So they get the community in and say, what should we be making? Which resulted in both of those, or had resulted in both those cases, in quite different things being manufactured by those factories that are still in occupation. So what I'm trying to say there is these are really existing examples of people doing technopolitics, techno-citizenship, techno-workerism, or whatever, which is why in the book, Product Placement, I talk about workers and people's councils. In terms of the violence question, I think it's really interesting in terms of a sort of Luddite movement and a complex question, right? And I just want to quote, because people might not know the example, as you may well do, but there was a bunch called Clodo. People heard of Clodo in the 1980s? Committee for the, I'm going to try it. Comité for liquidant ou détournement des ordinateurs. I think that's right. So the committee for the detournement, in other words, the sort of hacking, I suppose, or liquidation of computing. There's a great film I'm temporarily forget the name of the guys who did it, but it's called Machines in Flames, and it's freely available on YouTube at the moment. But the thing there is not so much the sort of burning down the data centers bit, it's more the name. It's like, yeah, detourn it if you can. Otherwise, liquidons, or abolish, as we might say these days, right? On Geoffrey Hinton, that's an interesting example. Really, if it was a Geoffrey Hinton, we wouldn't have any radiologists. When convolutional neural networks came along in the early teens of the 20 teens, you know, he was saying, don't train any more radiologists. I mean, this guy's personally beyond the pale. But what I do think is there are loads of people, and because we've met them. I know them, probably you guys have met them. There are loads of people working in the tech industry and the data science industry and all of those areas, not just the content moderators, but the engineers who have severe doubts about where this is all going, really want to find another direction. So myself and a guy called Michael Castell from Warwick, who some people might know of, we're trying to organize these critical AI meetups starting from the autumn to bring people like ourselves in this tiny room and bubble, those people together. My image, it's not Michael's one, but is a bit like if anyone's come across Science for the People movement from went through the 70s and 90s, something like that, where it's consciously taken on the literacy that needs to happen around the engineering, but taken that out to the movements of the people. That's enough.
Is anybody burning, or do you all want a drink? We've heard local, we've heard national, we've heard global, we've heard the need to work on the designing of the tech, we've heard the need to refuse for labor refusal, we've heard data abolitionism. All of it together needs to happen to really make a difference. And really, you do whatever you can do, whenever you can do it. What I like about this panel, I think, is the attempt to say, those things can link together. We're not doing these in isolation. It is, and actually that bid to build a movement around it could be incredibly powerful. So feel inspired. I'm going to offer you one sentence to take away for everybody here so that they've got something to talk about in the reception about what they're going to do next. And I'm going to start this time with Dan.
Well, I haven't got a prepared statement, but I'd just like to say that the last place to look for solutions is Silicon Valley, right? So just ignore everything that comes out of there. And, you know, it is within all the grasp of all of us to do something, you know, in the immediate sense. It's how we do that. That's the important thing. Whatever we do, it needs to build our collective capacity to be the basis for a different future.
Thank you very much. And just actually to build on the point that you made before, though, there's also, I'm a member of the Communication Workers Union. They have a branch called UTAW, United Tech Allied Workers. They're absolutely fantastic. They are people who work in tech, who love tech. Anybody who, all of us really, would really fit in there. I'm a member of that branch. And I would say check them out. They very much mimicked the Alphabet Union, which was the union that has tried to take on Amazon in the US. So they're also worth, you know, they're doing it. They're doing the kind of, and also coming back to what you were saying before about using violence or not, I would say no. I think some of the ideas that Alphabet Union and UTAW come up with are actually very, very clever and really make the point as well. So I'd say check them out. Thank you.
I would say that none of this is inevitable, and that we all have the ability to take back the power that big tech has taken from us, and together we can do that.
That's gorgeous. I would say join NoTechForTyrants, get involved, support us.
Fantastic. Please join me in thanking a really wonderful panel. And go eat, and we'll see you at the reception.